all food comes from somewhere. Even if you're eating something highly processed, like these candies, the ingredients from this eventually came from a ranch or a farm somewhere. The dairy for this came from a dairy farm somewhere in Milwaukee. The sugar from a sugarcane plantation somewhere in the Caribbean. And it all culminates into the products that we see today. Some of these things aren't direct ingredients. They could be derivatives from other products being created. But the point is that food isn't created in factories. It's assembled in factories. But the food itself always comes from farms. If you were to look at the packaging on most of these items, you'd be reasonable to think that the farms are quaint little green spacious places where crops grow in abundance and everybody's happy. Perhaps it's a little 5-person family. Pa makes flat cakes as the sun rises. Skippy the dog runs out with the kids as they go to milk the cow every morning. And it's easy to see how that picture is painted in our head. Here we've got a cow that's so realistic that there's not even a shadow. And this is what is meant to be portrayed in our mind. They want us to think that this is where our food is coming from, but you'd probably be pretty surprised to see what the dairy farms that this stuff comes from actually look like. Farms like these first saw production in the late 1800s and continued to grow in popularity throughout the decades of the 1900s. And even today, they are the most common types of farms. They are the conventional farms, conventional farming techniques. And this is further proven by labels such as non-GMO, organic, and all-natural. Way back when, everything was organic, all-natural, and non-GMO. But the fact that these labels exist is proof that those foods are in the minority today. The fact that things need to be labeled because they're different proves that they are not in the norm. When you look at most of this food, it's assumed that they are not organic, that they are GMO, and that they are not all natural because those labels don't exist on most of this food. The following information is in regards to the United States. While some parts may be true in other parts of the world, I encourage you to do your own research. You may have heard the terms CAFO and GMO tossed around a great deal, as well as some other labels. Let's talk labels. CAFO is a common abbreviation for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. CAFO is a designation by the US EPA, US Environmental Protection Agency. It is defined loosely as any operation in which animals are fed in confined spaces. However, there is a bit of discrepancy between AFOs, animal feeding operations, and CAFOs. Generally, the difference is that CAFOs are on a larger scale and the animals are in more confined spaces. But there is no hard and fast legal definition to describe the difference. This is part of the reason the lawsuits against them have been such trouble. The EPA does provide a definition for an AFO, which is, animals are kept and raised in confined situations. AFOs congregate animals, feed, manure, and urine dead animals and production operations on a small land area. Feed is brought to the animals rather than the animals grazing or otherwise seeking feed in pastures, fields, or on rangeland. To me, though, that sounds a lot like a CAFO. The first label that we're going to discuss today is no antibiotics ever, no antibiotics added, etc. There is documentation required to put this label onto your food if your food is poultry, beef, pork, or lamb. However, if it's fish or milk or eggs, you do not need documentation and you can just slap this label right on there. In fact, many companies will put the label on there despite adding antibiotics to their eggs, milk, or fish. Antibiotics may be applied for any number of reasons. Most commonly, though, in these operations, it's not applied as a result of an infection or even to combat an infection. Rather, it's included as a regular part of the animal's feed to help prevent infection in the first place. And this might not seem like a problem because the animals don't get sick very often, but actually it's turning into a pretty big problem because it's breeding a new type of bacteria called superbugs, who are being naturally selected to be highly resistant to this type of antibiotic. And everybody's applying them so liberally that there's often very strong trace amounts still in your food. You probably don't want to have that in your meal, but that's just a personal opinion at that point. Another label you might see is raised cage-free on your food. This is most commonly on rotisserie chickens and eggs. And it simply means that the animals are not confined to cages, which seems great, right? But It's not so great when you realize that to meet this qualification, that's all that you have to do. And in most cases, the animals, chickens most likely, don't even have access to something as simple as seeing the sky or having their little claws in the dirt. And in fact, most construction companies actually offer cheap housing that's nothing more than sheet metal walls and a roof just for this purpose, to keep as many chickens as possible inside of a confined structure so that they're protected from the elements, so less of them die from foxes, weather, etc., yet they can still meet the cage-free qualification. But in these places, usually the animals can't touch the ground, not because there's steel or flooring there, but because there's so many layers of feces, blood, and other dead chickens that it forms a solid layer. It's caked on that they can't even touch the ground. So cage-free is a step in the right direction, but it might not be the whole picture. Yet another common label that you might see is free range. This means that the animal has access to the outdoors. This could be their entire lives outdoors. This could be a couple hours a day, or it could be 5 minutes every 3 months. There's no minimum qualification for an animal to spend outside for their label to meet the free range qualification. And in fact, there's no minimum requirement for beef to meet the free range qualification. So that's a nice touch. So now you know what free range means, but what if it says pasture raised? Well, I'm sure you'll be very happy to know that there's actually no official definition for food to meet the pasture raised qualification. It's completely meaningless. So now you know what pasture raised means. That is nothing, but what about pasteurized milk? Well, that means that the milk was rapidly heated to a temperature hot enough to kill bacteria, then chilled rapidly enough that it's still safe and it will last a long time on the shelf, so it's available the next time a hurricane comes and you can buy it with all your bread and eggs. Another common label that you might see is grass-fed. This means that the animal received at least 1/2 of their nutrition from grass. But if this is not accompanied by an organic label, then the animal may have been fed some of the other nasties that we've already mentioned. And there's also no qualifier for what the grass itself was grown with. That could be insecticides, hormones, pesticides, etc. And I don't know about you, but I really don't want to be eating that stuff. Another common label that you might see is no added hormones or steroids. We're looking specifically at the hormones here, and we actually couldn't find this label in the store, but if you see a label that says hormone-free, run the other direction, because it's impossible to be a biologically alive being and not have hormones. Luckily, this one just says no additional hormones were added, which makes sense. But still, there's no way to regulate this. A similar label that you might see is no hormones administered. The only animal that's required to have documentation to actually put this label on the food is beef. On fish, eggs, and pork, there's no documentation process required in order to put this label on. And it's completely meaningless on packages like this ground turkey, because for poultry and pork, it's completely banned anyway. Vegetarian fed is another common label that you see on this food, and it also usually goes hand in hand with this no animal byproducts label directly below it. And what that means essentially is that there's no meat products in the feed. Typically, animal feed, especially for poultry, is composed of the cheapest available ingredients on the market. And this usually includes feces, blood, litter, and other dead animals, including animals of the same species. And vegetarian fed is one of the less evil ones, because it means that the chickens aren't eating the other chickens that died right next to them. And it means that their food is completely meat-free. You might be on the road to purchasing better and healthier food for yourself and your family. And one of those steps might be looking for labels that say natural or all natural, such as this pork right here. This label is most commonly seen on chicken. And it's a pretty interesting thing, because the qualifications for meeting this all natural or natural label are simply that your food is minimally processed. And the categories for this minimal processing are meat, chicken, and eggs. Which is kind of strange to me that chicken has its own category and it isn't included in the meat department. What's even more fascinating, though, is that There's something a little bit heinous going on behind the scenes here. A common practice is to create bouillon from the extra meat or scraps of the animal. That is, the innards of the chicken, the extra lengthy cuts that don't normally sell very well on shelves. So you'll create bouillon from that, and then it will get injected into the meat of the animal, usually along with a little bit of blood to add some color. That is, unless it's a white meat chicken, because people don't like to remember that there are nerves and blood inside of chickens. But anyway, the next time that you're eating a rotisserie chicken and it tastes especially good, remember that you're probably just tasting the injected bouillon and not the chicken itself. An incredibly dense and tricky topic in the food labeling world is that of the organics label. It's so confusing and convoluted that you are completely justified in not understanding it. I was very confused about it for many, many years, but luckily, in another part of this video series, we had the opportunity to interview Jamie Williams of the River Farm, who provided some amazing insights. She's been a farmer for many, many years, and on her farm they're currently pursuing an organic certification. And so she was able to provide answers to many of the questions that I had, and probably some of the questions that you had about what it takes to be organically certified and what it means if your food is organically certified. But for this video, I'll just tell you this. You want to look for an organically certifying organization, whether that be OMRI, EcoCert, or USDA Organic. Without those, there's not much merit to the organic certification. And even if it's not USDA Organic, most of these organizations do in fact follow the USDA qualifications to reach organic standards, and they actually go a little bit past it, being a bit more stringent. But if you want to hear more about organic certifications, we have an entire separate video on that topic. You can check it out right up here with Jamie. I'll see you over there, possibly. But let's talk a little bit more about food labels here. The three best certification labels to buy with, aside from organic, are Animal Welfare Approved, American Humane Certified, and Certified Humane Raised and Handled. These certs mean that the animals have both shelter and roaming space in abundance. It also means that they're able to perform wild behaviors. No crates, cages, or other containment methods are ever allowed. They're humanely slaughtered, and the food is verified to have no injected medications, hormones, or antibiotics. Picture in your mind for a minute, 200 years ago when you could purchase milk from your neighbor, eggs from the baker, meat from the butcher, and it was all organic. There was no label, and there was no suspicion in your mind that your neighbor was keeping 20,000 chickens in a sheet metal building with less than 15,000 square footage, then slaughtering them after 7 weeks. Then labeling the meat as cage-free, and feeding the layer of feces, mucus, urine, and carcasses to the rancher's cattle as feed. That isn't to say that things like that didn't happen, though. If you want to read more about that, check out Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. He was a meat packer in the early 1900s, and he details horrific acts, such as when the red meat started to spoil, they would inject kerosene to dilute the fat solutions and make the meat look more appealing and appetizing, despite the fact that it was actually rotting while it was being packaged. As you can see, trying to read labels on modern food is an absolute minefield. And it's intentionally designed that way. The less you know about the labels, the more convoluted and confusing things are, the more likely you are to make a choice that you didn't intend to. I'm of the opinion that if I wanted a chicken without bouillon injected into it, without hormones and steroids, I should be able to look for an all-natural label and expect the food to be all-natural. But according to these big companies, that opinion is wrong, or at least not profitable. Thank you for watching, but please keep in mind that we've only just scratched the surface on how to read food labels. And as long as these companies continue to make a profit by tricking you, these heinous practices will not stop. You vote with your dollar now more than ever, so make sure you're making the right choice. When you look at most to grow in popularity throughout the 1900s, I messed up the line. This is a terrible Photoshop job even. It's just like, there's no shadow. It's just like cow in field. If you were to look at the packaging on most of these items, you'd be reasonable to think that they were... Oh, that was kind of choppy, huh?
I think it was good.
Eggs, and something else that I don't remember. Antibiotics are for bacteria, not viruses. My bad. Another label you might see. What?
Your face was behind you. Your face was so serious.
Yeah, half. What's the battery at?
The battery was at 4%.
Okay. Another common label that you might see is grass-fed. This means that the animals see root head up. Yeah.
Careful. You got obstacles.
Remember last time?
Last time?
When I knocked it over?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Ready?
Yeah.
One of the other common labels that you see is vegetarian Fred. Vegetarian.
Okay, I'm done.
One of the other common labels.
Sorry.
One label that you'll see is vegetarian.
I need a snack.
Vegetarian fed is another common label that you see on this food. Wait. So you might be on the road to trying to buy better food for yourself. You might be on the road, such as this pork right here. Boom. That was the line that I was reaching for.
Very good.